sabato mattina, è stato fino adesso uno straordinario sabato e siamo sicuri finirà in gloria questa mattinata femminile. Sono stata intervistata spesso durante questi giorni, mio malgrado, e una delle cose che ho ripetuto più spesso quando mi si chiedeva cosa c'era di speciale in questa edizione, risposta difficilissima naturalmente, è stata quella di citare questo incontro perché Rita Dove, una poetessa di una grandezza straordinaria, conosciuta in America e ovunque, non è tradotta in Italia. E io ho continuato a ripetere che una delle ambizioni di Incroci di Civiltà era precisamente creare questo ponte, aprire questa finestra e essere un po' una vetrina per questa poetessa straordinaria. Quindi ho risposto a questa domanda proprio esplicitando questa ambizione e naturalmente su questo non si molla, anzi si parte proprio da questa conversazione di questa mattina. Magari una casa editrice veneziana, non faccio nomi. Ringrazio per il sostegno che ha reso possibile questa conversazione la Scuola di Relazioni Internazionali. Come sapete, Incroci è fatto di tanti piccoli, cruciali tasselli che lo rendono possibile. È un evento a tutti gli effetti di Ateneo proprio perché è sempre più percepito come trasversale di tutti e lo è. Invito quindi qui con me, on stage, Rita Dove, Sally Michael e Duccio Basosi.
Buongiorno. That's all the time I have. First of all, I want to thank everyone who has made this possible. I think it's a wonderful conference, a wonderful festival celebration of the crossroads of civilization and culture. And this is going to be slightly different than perhaps what you've heard before, because as a poet, I have the luxury of speaking in between the poems if necessary, and to give you a wider spectrum, perhaps, of the work and where it has gone or where it is going, rather than having to read just one little section out of a book, out of a prose book. And so what I have decided to do, when I was asked to come here, was to give you a sense of my project, I guess you could say, my artistic project. I'm going to start with some fairly early poems, two poems from a book called Museum. And it is not your ordinary museum, it's a museum that never see. It's a museum that never speaks, the silent museum. These two poems are actually set in Italy. The first poem is told from the point of view of Boccaccio. And I don't need to explain Boccaccio to you. In America, sometimes I do. The second poem is a companion piece to that, and I will read them without interruption from one to the other. But the second poem is, in essence, Fiammetta's response to the romantic and lovesick Boccaccio. Boccaccio, the plague years. Even at night, the air rang and rang. Through the thick swirled glass, he watched the priests sweep past in their peaked hoods, collecting death. On each stoop, a dish burning sweet, clotted smoke. He closed his eyes to hear the slap of flesh onto flesh, a liquid crack like a grape as it breaks on the tongue. As a boy, he had slipped along the same streets, in love with he didn't know whom, Oh, the reeded sonatinas and torch flick on the chill, slick sides of the bridge and steam rising in plumes from the slaughterhouse vents. 20 years. Rolling out of the light, he leaned his cheek against the rows of bound leather. Cool water. Fiammetta. He had described her 100 ways, each time she had proven unfaithful. If only he could crack the city in two so the moon would scour the wormed streets clean. Or walk away from it all, simply falling in love again. Fiammetta breaks her peace. I've watched them, Mother, and I know the signs. The first day, rigor. Staggering like drunks, they ram the room's sharp edges with the most delicate bodily parts and feel no pain. Unable to sleep, they shiver beneath all the quilts in the house, panic gnawing a silver path to the brain. Day 2 is fever, the bright stream clogged, eyes rodent red. No one weeps anymore, just waits, for appear they must in the armpits, at the groin, hard, blackened apples. Then, at least, there is certainty, an odd kind of relief. A cross comes on the door. A few worthy citizens gather possessions around them and spend time with fine foods, wine, and music behind closed drapes. Having left the world already, they are surprised when the world finds them again. Still others carouse from tavern to tavern, doing exactly as they please. And to think he wanted me beautiful, to be his fresh air, and my breasts two soft, spiced promises. Stand still, he said once, and let me admire you. All is infection, Mother, and avarice, and self-pity, and fear. We shall sit quietly in this room, and I think we'll be spared. Before I go on, and so we all know what this little piece of paper is that flew out, I wanted to thank the people who were responsible for these wonderful translations. Stephanie Bassett, who's a student here at the university, did these translations, and they were looked over by Roberto Ranieri, and he said they were wonderful. And I could tell, as I was talking to Stephanie before this began, I said I could tell by the questions she had asked in the margins, even though they were in Italian, that she was on the right track, so I was really pleased with that. Yes, and now, this poem is from a book called On the Bus with Rosa Parks, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit. Dawn Revisited. Imagine you wake up with a second chance. The blue jay hawks his pretty wares, and the oak still stands, spreading glorious shade. If you don't look back, the future never happens. How good to rise in sunlight, in the prodigal smell of biscuits, eggs, and sausage on the grill. The whole sky is yours to write on, blown open to a blank page. Come on, shake a leg. You'll never know who's down there frying those eggs if you don't get up and see. I've written several books of poetic sequences, which are loosely, I think the best way to describe them is to say that each poem is like a pearl on a necklace. And They stand alone, but sometimes they shine a little better next to the next one and they tell a story. The end. This poem is from my most recent book called Sonata Lunatica, which is a novel sequence of poems. Deals with one historical character. His name was George Holgreen Bridgetower. He was an Afro-European. His mother was of Middle European Polish extraction. His father called himself an African prince. He was born in 1780 and was a violinist, a brilliant violinist by all accounts. His one claim to fame was that he met Beethoven, and Beethoven composed a sonata for him. And when I realized that I didn't know very much about this man, and that he had somehow slipped between the cracks of history, let's put it that way, that started me on a quest to find out more. And it resulted in this book. There is a difficulty with reading from the book because obviously it tells an entire story, but I will read you one poem near the end, which is in fact a poem not from his point of view, but from Beethoven's point of view, at the end of his life. And as you know, Beethoven left Germany, left Bonn, came to Vienna, and spent the rest of his life there. The composer's coda. I wanted fame. I wanted love. I deserved bliss, but bliss scares easily. I fled Bonn's dreary terrain for Vienna's grave note. There I learned to cherish even the gaps, the static. Fame became moot. Love, a strategy. Beauty was what I couldn't seem to hang on to. Beauty would discharge her blandishments, then retreat to observe the effect. Now I know none of this is real. None of this exists. That next moment, shimmering before you, wink, and it will either astonish you or be gone. And the final poem that I'll read, well, who knows, but I think it is the final one for now. I chose because it takes place on St. Mark's Square, right here in Venice. And the weather in this poem is about the weather of today, just almost, it's almost about to rain in this poem. And there are a few more tourists in this poem than you find at this time of year. And give it a month and this is what will be. What I loved to do when I'm surrounded by tourists, and of course I was one of them in this case, is to stand back and watch, to be on the edge of things. And I love to see how the pigeons navigated that traffic as well as the Venetians. The poem is called Ta-Ta Cha-Cha, and it is also an attempt to imitate the rhythms of a cha-cha as well. Ta-ta cha-cha. 1, 2, no, 5 doves scatter before wingtips' distracted tread. Lost, lost, they coo, and they're probably right. It's Venice, I'm American, besandaled and backpacked, sunk in a bowl of sky trimmed with marbled statuary, slate, snow, ash, a dazed array dipped in the moon's cold palette. Who? You? No. But here, lost from a wing, drifts one pale italicized answer. I pick it up as the bold shoe continues conversation, 1, 2, with its mate. And the nearest scavenger skips 3 times to the side, bobs to pluck his crackerjack prize, a child's dropped gelato cone. Tip-tap, early warning code for afternoon rain. Gray vagabond, buffoon messenger for grounded lovers, where to? Teach me this dance you make, snatching a sweet from the path of a man who, because he knows where he is headed, walks without seeing, face hidden by a dirty wingspan of the daily news.
Hello everyone. I'm really honored to be among you here today. And before we continue with the beautiful poetry, I would love to share with you a very quick bio of Dr. Rita Dove. Dr. Rita Dove is a Commonwealth Professor of English at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where she actually lives with her husband and her daughter. Her collection, Thomas and Beulah, written in 1986, won a Pulitzer Prize for poetry. That makes her actually the second African American to win the prize. Dr. Dove has 8 prolific poetry volumes to her credit, and please allow me to name them. The Ale House on the Corner, Museum, Thomas and Beulah, Grace Notes, Mother-in-Law, On the Bus with Rosa Parks, American Smooth, and last but not least, Sonata Mulatica. She also has 1 play, 1 novel, and a collection of short stories to her credit. So when we talk about Dr. Dove as a poet, she's not just a poet like the rest of the poets that you've read. There's a lot more to her than just poetry. There's a lot of narrative and dramatic work in her verse. In 1993, and for 2 years, Dr. Dove was appointed to the term of Poet Laureate and a consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress. That made her actually the youngest person and the first African American poet to receive the highest official honor in American letters. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rita Dove. I was first introduced to you on a felucca in the Nile in 1999. A felucca is like the water boat here in Venice, only that we used to take that for simply entertainment. So I used to go with my friends on felucca rides. We used to eat poetry and to read poetry and eat pizza. But the kind of pizza we have is probably not the same as the pizza you eat here in Venice. I was actually a PhD student at the time, and I was trying to research an author for my PhD thesis. I was quite definitive about the kind of poetry I wanted to read, and I defined that poetry on both as poetry that takes wings. And suddenly, one of my friends just said, "Read Dove." And of course, the whole felucca laughed because we were not sure about, the kind of energy that was created with wings and Dove. Speaking of names, I always believe that naming is framing. Has your name had any kind of impact on the poetry that you write?
We grow into our names, we grow around our names, we try to make sense of our names. I think every child sits there and contemplates their name and tries to change their identity. So of course my name did have an impact on me. First of all, I was told at a very young age that the Rita was for Rita Hayworth. And my mother loved Rita Hayworth movies and watched them when she was pregnant. And the Dove actually comes from Cherokee. My father came up from Georgia, and there are white doves in Rockmart, Georgia, and there are black doves in Rockmart, Georgia, and everything in between. So that mix of heritage, but also a very beautiful name, I felt lucky to have that name. I'm sure that the sense of the idea that I was attracted to the pigeons in St. Mark's Square has something to do with my name. And I actually slip a dove in every book. I do put the word dove or dove in every book, just for the heck of it. But it has had an impact on my name. I do believe that one of the major differences in the music of poetry and the music of, let's say, newspaper, is that poetry does take wing. It does lift off the page, and in a very curious way, even though it may deal with a similar topic, it may deal with something contemporary, it may be a narrative. At the same time, it at some point leaves the restraints of language. It lifts off the page. I often tell my students, because I do teach at the University of Virginia, and I tell them that when you are writing poetry, there is some point where silence is what you're writing. You're not writing the words, you're writing the words to get at the silence behind them, which is another way of taking off, I think.
Well, I think words show up a lot in your work, as you said. But I was wondering about the symbolic level of those birds. What you mean exactly? Are these birds of escape or birds of flight, freedom?
Both. In the sense that a bird has to light sometime. And that there really is no escape. I don't even define it as escape. One lives off in order to get the lay of the land, but I feel like you always come back, and I don't consider that a prison necessarily. It's just what it is. I do think too that one of the stories from the Bible that had always impressed me as a child were those doves that Noah set off to see if there was land at any point. And I was actually rather distressed when the one didn't come back. The last dove when it doesn't come back. I just thought, well, how can you leave your home? But so I think I'm more the one who would like to take a Rundflug. I want to take a little trip around the perimeter and come back.
You have toyed brilliantly with many forms, namely villanelles, sestinas, sonatas, and sonnets. And I was wondering if you think that poems choose their forms. How do you go about selecting a form for a poem?
I never select the form. The form does select me, and it's a matter of listening. And it's really a matter of listening to what kind of dance I'm going to make between language and silence. So for instance, there's a poem that I have, a fairly political poem called Parsley, which deals with the Dominican Republic and Rafael Trujillo and his execution of Haitian cane workers in 1937. And he chose the Spanish word for parsley, and had each one of the cane workers speak this word, perejil. And the Haitians could not pronounce the R, so it came out as a perejil. And so this was his way of having them pronounce their own death sentence. Those who could not roll their R's were slaughtered. Now, he had approximately 20,000 slaughtered in a single day. In trying to write that poem, it was a question of figuring, how do you get the drum beat, the rhythm of that word spoken over and over and over? And because of that, I chose the villanelle, because the villanelle keeps turning back on itself as a verse form. You always have these repeated lines. It's a way of saying you can never escape it. So it always chooses. It's a kind of a mysterious process, but it always chooses itself. There's another book, Mother Love, which is a group of sonnets, and they're all about mother-daughter relationships based on Persephone and Demeter. And it just seemed like a no-brainer that they would be little love poems, sonnets.
When the organizers asked me to participate in these conversations, I was thrilled. And then after 5 minutes, I realized that as an historian, I didn't really know what I would be able to ask and how I would be able to perform in this conversation. So I decided to not to pretend that I am a great expert in poetry and do my job as an historian. And so my first question, since we were talking about form, brings me right into one of my great questions for me at the time. Aristotle, in Book 9 of Poetics, speaks about the difference between the poet and the historian. And he says that the difference is not in the fact that one writes prose and the other writes in verse. He says the true difference is that the historian relates what has happened, while the poet what may happen. Poetry is more philosophical and more elevated than history, since poetry states more universal things, whereas history states particular things. End of quote. In an interview which I found preparing this conversation, you said that a poet struggles to render into words that which is unsayable. And so my question is, are we historians condemned to permanent inferiority?
There are just different ways of looking at the same thing. No, you're not condemned to inferiority. It's there are different ways of looking at the same thing. I always feel that without the history, without the historian, I would not have known about, for instance, Trujillo's parsley event, or I would not have known about George Baldwin Bridge Tower, though there was very little research, but there was some. Without that, I would have not known the broad facts, what had happened. But that opened it up for me to imagine what might have happened in his head, in Bridge Tower's head, his violinist, what it would have been like to look out of his eyes at that time, and then to make then history come alive. So I think of it more as a symbiotic relationship. And I do think that comes from living that odd metaphysical friction as an African American, as a woman, in a world which most of the time is not geared directly toward my slant in life. When I was growing up, and even now, but when I was growing up, I knew that there were two different ways of looking at the world. And that meant either I fit into the mainstream and moved along, and that had its own language, its own rhythm, its own dress code, practically. And then there was the African American community. And it was completely normal for me and my cousins and my friends to even switch the way we talked. We could walk from one room to the next, and suddenly the whole music was different, the whole way of acting was different. So from birth, pretty much, as soon as I was aware of things, I knew there was one story, and then there was a way of looking at it from the side. And I always thought of that actually as more of an advantage than a disadvantage. And Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, the black historian, talks about having binocular vision, that when you are not of the mainstream, that you can see things in 3 dimension a lot easier because you will see all sides. So, I've always been aware that there was a story that was easily accessible to historians, and that would make it into the history books. And there were 1,000 stories that would never make it in there. Obviously, you can't put every story in there, but some should be in there. And obviously, too, every minute that we live in a day matters to us, but all of that will disappear too. And that's what interests me as a poet, all that stuff that disappears. So you take care of the big stuff and I'll take care of it. I'll take care of the little.
Thank you.
Speaking of history, you've been always referred to in most of the interviews that you've had as the historian of the everyday. Because, as you just said, you always look at the other side of the grand historical events. Is this your way of personalizing the grand narrative of history?
I'm contemplating the frame of the question. Is this your way of personalizing? Because I think that I don't think of it quite that way. I'm not personalizing history. I'm saying this is another history. For instance, let me give an example. When I began work on Sonata Melodica, on the story of George Bridgetown, I didn't approach it from the outside saying, oh, look at this interesting character from history, let me now give him flesh. What happened was that I wanted to get to know him. And so it began actually as a historical pursuit. I began to try to find out details about his life. Then it became, what would it be like to walk down the street in London in 1790 as a little dark-skinned boy with a violin tucked under my arm. That, so, and I didn't think of it from the outside. Now, the effect it may have is the idea of personalizing the grander history. But one thing that poetry does, I think, is to keep confounding that idea that you can stand back and look at it, but that you are deep in the middle of it, experiencing it, and in fact feel that it is happening right at this moment. So it's one of the reasons why I don't do a kind of a BBC British mix of language, but that it's actually very down to earth and contemporary. Some of it is very up to date, and there's even a farce in the book, a little play with people singing Supreme songs. I mean, you kind of have to bring it up to the here and now, so that it doesn't become a decoration, but it becomes a different way of apprehending and living truth.
On the Bus with Rosa Parks is one of the most contested volumes that you've ever written. I read the book as a tribute to Rosa Parks, the woman who's a simple songstress who, by simply doing nothing, had actually helped ignite the civil rights movement. I was just wondering about your choice of keeping the Rosa Parks poems toward the very, very end of the volume, and how does this answer to the way you look back to the past?
You noticed that, huh? Okay. Well, let me give you a little introduction to those poems. The volume, and I'll tell you a little bit about the volume too. It is true that the book is called On the Bus with Rosa Parks. The Rosa Parks poems are about 3/4 of the way through the book, and that was or even later, that that was a very deliberate choice, because it is so very easy, particularly in the United States, to relegate one's race or one's difference into a specialized pocket where, especially in culture, so that they can say, oh, you're an African American poet, you're a woman poet, you're an Asian American poet, and then you don't have to feel so bad if you don't read them, if they don't make the syllabus, if, number one. Number two is that the danger that is inherent in any kind of label, is that we immediately put a filter on and read it through what we perceive, or what we think we know about that particular area. And my concern was that when we read those poems, when people read the poems about Rosa Parks, or about the entire civil rights movement, which is what they are about, that we don't immediately think of the dogs and the hoses, and we think of the people who actually did this, and that they were entire and complete human beings with problems, with, you know, blisters on their toes, with dreams of going home and having a cup of coffee. That's why I'm confounded by putting it near the end of the book. And so that by the time you get to those poems, hopefully one's antenna are tuned to take in the entire person. And in that entire mix, even with those poems about Rosa Parks, there are poems in there which deal with other women who did just as heroic acts as Rosa Parks, who also did not get off the buses, who were jailed, but who did not make the history books because they were not politically expedient. I'll read a small poem. It's a very little poem, and I think we can do it without translation. I'll talk you through it. There it is. And it's called simply Rosa. How she sat there, the time right inside a place so wrong it was ready. That trim name with its dream of a bench to rest on, her sensible coat. Doing nothing was the doing, the clean flame of her gaze carved by a camera flash. How she stood up when they bent down to retrieve her purse, that courtesy. Rosa Parks was chosen to serve as the test case for desegregating the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. For many reasons, but the main reason was that she looked, as we all know, like a very sweet little librarian. She looked so unassuming that the NAACP and the other groups decided that she would be unassailable. No one could cast aspersions on her. And in fact, when she went in for her court date, a few days after the arrest, and there was a huge crowd in front of the courthouse, one woman yelled out, "Oh, look at her. Ain't she sweet? Boy, they're in trouble now." And that's just, that's part of it. The fact that there were several other women, but one of them, she had a child out of wedlock, so they didn't want to use her because she could have been attacked. Another one did not have a good enough job, they thought, so she could have been attacked. So the political, the historical come into that mix too. That kind of caution, I think, was also something that I was doing in the book, building the case so that you could only look at everything that happened in those poems about Rosa Parks in a humanitarian way, in a humane way, and not with an agenda.
It's a beautiful minimalist poem in which less is actually more. I mean, I think you're one of those poets who knows how to functionalize silences sometimes. I would like to go back to Dawn Revisited, and I would borrow the line, if you don't look back, the future never happens. How do you perceive of time, both artistically and personally?
Well, I think it is true that if you don't look back at your past, of course, there are all of these quotes, well, you're doomed to repeat it, but if you don't look back, the future does not have any real shape, and one stumbles right into it. At the same time, as that poem tries to say, as that poem says, you do have to plunge into that future. If you don't go downstairs to see who's doing those eggs, you'll never know if you don't try. And I also think that in terms of creativity, in terms of writing, there's that, for me, exactly that kind of push and pull. When I'm writing, if I am not surprised by something at some point in the creation of anything that I write, it's not going to be any good. If I'm not surprised by something, then if I'm writing with a sense of I know exactly where I'm going, that's boring, and that's going to be boring to you too. When I say find something out and be surprised, what I mean is to discover something. Writing is a terrifying thing. It's a terrifying act. It's an exhilarating act, but one writes to figure out why one is haunted by something. And even if there is, even with all of the data that one can have around a historical action, there has to be something that surprises you. When I began Rosa Parks' poems, and I began them thanks to my daughter, who is now 31, but at that time she was around 12, and my husband and I had taken her with us to a conference with high school students. And there were a whole group of luminaries who were going to give speeches for their high school students, and we came from all different aspects of life. There were poets and movie directors and political figures and etc. And Rosa Parks was also there. And we were being taken from venue to venue in buses. So we got on the bus, and Rosa Parks was sitting in the front of the bus. And we went to the back of the bus, and everyone just piled on, and our daughter leaned over and said, "We're on the bus with Rosa Parks," which was a perfectly iambic line, on the bus with Rosa Parks. And I heard the music of it, and the wonder in her voice, and I wrote it in my notebook. And that started. So what does it mean to be on the bus with Rosa Parks? And all the permutations of that word. So, yeah, that's how it started, but I had no idea how it was going to end up.
I also have a question on Rosa. Two things struck me of the poem, besides the fact that it's beautiful, which is the third thing. The first thing is that you tell us very little about this person. We know it's a she, and that she has a sensible coat, that she's sitting, and that doing nothing was the doing. But I mean, we know it's Rosa Parks. We know that there's a lot of history condensed here. But you did not really tell us that she is Rosa Parks. So there's this element first. And then what struck me was the fact that you used the term dream in the poem. And if I think of Rosa Parks, I think of the civil rights movement, and I think of the word dream, then what comes to my mind is the speech by Dr. Martin Luther King, I have a dream. But while the dream of Martin Luther King was so magniloquent, the dream of Rosa is the dream of a bench to rest on. So if I put the two things together, and I know that we should never ask poets what they meant to say, but this is exactly what I'm going to do now. Are you kind of telling us that we should not look at these figures as heroes, that they have to be humanized? Are you humanizing these figures? Are you telling us that more or less all women could be Rosa Parks? That there's a human face behind the symbol?
Well, I think your analysis is very good. Actually, you picked out all of these points that kind of the sympathetic strings that are being struck in the poem. Of course, we should look at them as heroes, but we should also look at them as human beings. And remember that they are human beings. The question of what is it like to be on the bus with Rosa Parks is what, to put ourselves in that position, what would we have done in that moment? And, you know, what perfect storm would have had to occur in order for that moment to take place. Many acts of heroism come down to something very small and very human, such as just being able to sit on a bench that's not marked for colored only or for whites only, or being able to drink some water when you're thirsty and not having to search it out, and to sit down at a lunch counter and be served. And then these things grow into something grand and almost unfathomable in terms of the heroism. But in the end, you really just want someone to look you in the eye and treat you as a human being. As a poet, though a poet may strive for the universal, I feel that poets do that by going through the detail, always the detail. So it is, the word dream, for instance, sounds like a very big word, but especially if you think of it in terms of Dr. Martin Luther King, but also is just dreaming of finding a bench to sit on. And speaking of names, I mean, a name like Rosa Parks, which is a very concise, short, sweet name, but with that part in there. The park is in there, you know, somehow. So I think that we have mythologized almost so many of the heroes of the civil rights movement, and in particular Rosa Parks, that it's very difficult to get past that and see her as a human being. Instead of trying to give her a whole life story that I know nothing about and that it would be presumptuous, in that poem I chose to simply make her every woman, any woman who just wants to rest for a moment. But we all know who she is. And to get both that impenetrability, that camera flash, and at the same time realize there is a human being in there who just wants a little bit of quiet. Don't we all?
I catch up from here to bring you farther away from poetry. Again, as I was preparing this conversation, I read that you are the second Afro-American poet to win the Pulitzer Prize and first laureate poet consultant to the Library of Congress. And I stopped for a while and started thinking that you're not described as, you're not the first poet from Ohio to win the Pulitzer Prize, or the first graduate from the University of Miami, or the first tango dancer, So basically the question is about what is your take on the color line in the age of Obama?
Just a little question, it's just a little. One would hope, I would hope that Oswald is the one. That's too safe. I would hope that there would come a day when we would have these kinds of, that we would not immediately say the first African American, et cetera, et cetera. But that is I think, a disingenuous thing to hope for. We also, when we look at someone, we do see who they are. And why not acknowledge that, as long as we see the entire person? And that's the other side of that. It's, to say that we're in a colorblind society is idiotic. We are not. And we have a long way to go. I think it does just as much damage not to acknowledge that someone comes from a certain heritage, or than to acknowledge it. It depends on how, what you bring to the table when you say that. I've been in so many conversations with people where they'll say, oh, Mary Flo, she's from Alabama, and now they'll do all this stuff, and I'll say, is she white or black? Because I can tell that they're talking all around a description. I'm saying, describe the woman. But we are shy about doing that because we want to be politically correct. And so there's all sorts of shynesses and awkwardnesses that come from the fact that we are not comfortable with acknowledging each other's differences and at the same time saying that we are all human beings. That's the one thing. I think that we're making strides all the time. I'm rather resigned to it. I know that I will be described in those terms. I find it rather shameful that I'm only the second African American got a Pulitzer Prize. And I'm hoping that it's on a day where it's going to be so many that they can't just say, oh, it's the 10th. They'll just say, this is a Pulitzer Prize winner. So, but I've also resigned myself to the fact that that's going to be one of the things that's a label I'm going to carry around. Only thing I ask, or that I hope, that I fight against all the time, is that someone just doesn't say, oh, she writes about being an African American. I write about being a human being. And part of that is sometimes being African American, sometimes it's being a woman, sometimes it's being a tango dancer. But do not take away part of my humanity so that you can fit me into an easy corner. One of the things that is very difficult for someone who is not of a marginalized group of any sort, it's difficult to apprehend, are the assumptions that you can just have when you walk out into the world. That you can walk into a room and no one will look at you and say, oh, they're different. That's a luxury, and that's the way it's always going to be, perhaps. But at the very same time, I don't want someone to look at me and only see that, and then, therefore, not be able to hear me when I speak or talk.
You've always been discreet about expressing racial indignation. There's always anger there, but it's a different kind of anger. It's a neutralized anger that you've definitely dealt with. I would like to know your take on that. How do you deal with anger, both on a personal and on a poetic level?
Wow, we're really getting deep here now. Well, first of all, I grew up, my generation of, I would say my generation fell right in between let's put it that, right in between Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement. I was too young to march in the March of Washington, which took place on my birthday when I was 11 years old, and yet my father did. I was when the Black Power Movement came up in the 60s, I was just getting out of high school. Actually just entering high school and getting into high school. So I read Sonia Sanchez, and I read Amir Baraka, with Leroy Jones at that time, and then changed to Amir Baraka. But I did not meet them until later in my life. So that was the one thing. My father was the first African-American chemist in the rubber industry. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, which is the rubber capital of the world. That meant tires, mostly. And he integrated that field as a chemist, and yet I didn't know anything of his struggles until I was in high school. I didn't know that he had run the elevator at Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, and that he had ferried actually his old classmates, who all got jobs before him, of course, up and down in that elevator for a few years before he finally broke that barrier. And when I asked him, I said, why did you keep this from us? He said, I didn't want you to become bitter, because bitterness is a dead-end street. And he said, I wanted you to have as long as possible, to feel that you could do anything. Okay. And that was his generation's sacrifice for us. So, but that idea that bitterness is a dead-end street, that it doesn't get you anywhere, became a kind of a mantra for me, because I felt that if I shout, people hold their ears. If I whisper, they have to lean in and listen. And you're right, the anger is there, but I don't shout it. But it's there sometimes.
Okay, I'll take you away from the deep waters and into writing. You just mentioned that writing is a difficult process. I was wondering about how you characterize this. Do you start from a conscious or an unconscious plane of recognition? How do these seeds germinate? And what is it that comes first? Is the word more attractive than the cadence? Because when I read you, I think more, you're not just a poet. When I read the poetry, I listen to music. I enjoy the moves. I feel the dance. Aside from American Smooth, your poetry dances and sings and plays all sorts of musics. So I was wondering about your take on this.
Yes, which comes first, the word or the music? And I would say that the word is the music and the music is the word. They're not separable in my mind. I would say that for me, what comes first is it really is language first. So in other words, I'll overhear a phrase. I'll hear a word and say, and it suddenly sounds like a foreign word, even though I've heard it all my life. And that's where it starts. Usually. And I do proceed by language, because I feel this, for me as a poet, the story takes care of itself. The story takes care of itself. It's the way the story is told that I'm responsible for, and that it has to sing, it has to dance. You do hear the music, perhaps, because I grew up with music. I played the cello from the age of 10. I've played the viola da gamba in later years, and then I started taking, when I couldn't carry that gamba around, it was a bass gamba, all over the place, I started taking voice lessons, and then my husband and I do ballroom dancing. So music is in my life, and it will always be in my life. And to me, language is yet another way of having music in my life. And every language has its own music. And so for me, the poem begins with the way it sounds. The thing is the way it sounds. Very often I will start a poem in the very middle of the page. I even know that the word begins in the middle of the page, and I'll put, or phrase, and I'll put it in the middle of the page, and I just look at it, and I'll wait for the rest of it to start. It starts gathering itself around. So, and I work in fragments. I have a very strange way of composing. I tend to work on many poems at once, so that I'll write a little bit on one, and then I'll write a little on another, and then I'll put them away, and I put them in color-coded folders. And this is all to keep it on the unconscious level, not on the level of intellect and discourse, but on a deeper level. And because I feel that as one of the things that poetry has going forward more intensely than other disciplines is that you can control the very way in which the reader breathes. And if you have your reader breathing with you, just then part of the work of bringing them into the story is done already. And this happens in prose as well, but it's a longer breath. So that means that I'm orchestrating language in order to get at an emotion as well, and therefore it has to happen at a deeper level for me. So I do tend to try to write so that the music is ever present and is just, each word is drenched in it.
Say that poets do not fit certain categories. How different is this space that you occupy as a poet?
I mean, this is an interesting question, because I think that I don't find the great divide that some people feel between prose writers and poets and dramatists. I feel that we're all dealing at some very, very intimate level with language, and we just have a different pulse. Let's put it that way. So that I have some colleagues who are poets who just think that if you write prose, you're somehow a lesser being or something. And I'm like, are you crazy? It's all difficult. It's all difficult. It's all wonderful. All at some level is dealing with trying to put the ineffable, I think, into words, so that we again can feel the ineffable. It kind of goes around full circle. So I don't feel that, but I do think that what poetry does that is different, and this goes back to, I think, to Aristotle's definition of the historian and the poet, is that the poet makes you stop for a moment. It's sort of like you stop in the flow of time, and life flows around you for an instant while you contemplate it and your interior. So you're both looking into the well and standing at the well while everybody walks around you gathering water. And that makes you feel when you're reading a poem or if you're writing a poem, because this is a great relationship between reader and poet. It makes you feel like time is moving around you, but you're standing still. Even if you're talking to someone next to you, you're still standing still. It's a disconnect. So that does feel different. And that's why I'm saying that poetry is different than the other disciplines. When I write stories or prose or even drama, it's a different feeling. I think it also because prose it moves through time. There is a narrative that moves through time. So you can decide either to open a book, a novel, and dive into its flow of time, or you can decide to stay out. With a poem, it tends to ambush you and snatch you out. Suddenly you're, oh my God, where am I? And that makes you feel a little distracted and a little bit disconnected, in a good way.
I would like to ask you something about another word that often occurs in your writings, which is the word freedom. Of course, we know that freedom is a quite crucial word in the United States, from the Declaration of Independence onwards, and possibly even before that. As an historian, once again, if I think of the word freedom in political terms, I think of Eric Foner's History of American Liberty and his learned explanation of how freedom in the United States isn't a set of enlarging circles. It's not the same freedom that actually reaches more and more people. But in reality, what happens throughout 200 years of U.S. history is that freedom changes substantially. The freedom to own slaves, or the freedom to treat women as commodities, is not the freedom that we know after the abolishing of slavery, after the movement for women's rights. And so that is one point. The other is Janis Joplin's definition of freedom as just another word for nothing left to lose. And so what is your take on this crucial word?
As soon as you said the word freedom, I couldn't get Janis Joplin out of my mind. I was just going to read the singer. Well, like any word, and anyone who's a writer knows that any word, it can be turned on its head and mean exactly the opposite. And I think freedom is one of those words that the United States thinks that it has invented. And perhaps it has invented its own brand of freedom. I think that it's curious. The sense of, I'm not a historian, I'm not going to go there too deeply, except to say that I've always been intrigued by the fact that this sense of individualism that just puts a stamp on Americans, United States idea of freedom is very crucial. The idea that in America, freedom is an individual thing. That means one can have the freedom to treat someone badly, or the freedom to freedom of speech, which can cover hate speech at times. And it's a very murky area. It's also, there's a sense in the United States that if, which is historically just the way it ran, that if you didn't feel free enough, you just kept going. You just kept going west. You just kept going, move, 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 until you hit the land of celluloid dreams. Until you hit Los Angeles, which is another way of running from reality, I think, with film sometimes. So freedom is not a fixed point. It's not anything like that in the United States. And I look at the word with many grains of salt. It's not a word that I would simply like to define and say, oh yes, freedom means being able to do what you want to do, being able to, no, I wouldn't want to define it that way. Because every freedom is dependent upon how someone else treats you as well. I mean, you can be free to walk the streets, but if someone is going to hurl something at you, you are not free. And you can feel free in your mind. And for me, I think freedom is much more of a private thing. That I want to have the freedom to be able to think without pushing up against impediment. And that's harder than one thinks. That's harder than one imagines can happen. I'm trying to think, there's a poem. Where is it? Because it does have this ambivalent way of thinking about freedom. I won't read it for you, but I'll read the last couple lines of it. It's called Pastoral, and the poem takes place in that moment where a young mother is breastfeeding, and she's looking down on her child, breastfeeding, and she says at the end, I felt then what a young man must feel with his first love asleep on his breast, desire and the freedom to imagine it. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about freedom, because there's that curious feeling of, in this moment of the young mother, you would think that at that moment when she's breastfeeding, she's, first of all, completely independent. She's her own source of, she can provide food for the child, all on her own. That's an incredible sense of independence. At the same time, she feels absolutely beholden to that creature. But that's also an odd kind of freedom. And the love that's connecting them is, in a certain way, based on desire. So she's, at that moment when she says, you know, I feel like what a young man must feel with his love asleep on his breast, how he can look out and just imagine the world. At that moment she's saying, I can do this with this child too. I can imagine the world and still feel love, but to have the freedom to be able to imagine that. That is the best thing of all. So it's very complicated. Yeah.
Okay, allow me to take you back to the beautiful world of music and Sonata Monatica, which is one of my favorite volumes. I think the book is a tribute to the worlds of both poetry and music, as it pieces together the life of a man whose life was later shattered by race selectivity. In the volume, you start off by defining the story as, this is a story about music and what it does to those who make it, whom it enslaves. Yes, slavery of all kinds enters into the mix. I also think that the volume answers the question of how does the shadow shine? I wonder, how was the idea of the volume conceived?
It was one of those wonderful chance moments. What had happened was, my husband and I were relaxing. I had just finished a book of poems, American Smooth, and sent it off to the publisher, and thought, oh, I don't have to, I can relax for a month or so. And we sat down one evening to watch a movie. The movie was Immortal Beloved. It's a biographical movie about Beethoven. And we were watching. It was, it's a pretty good film, but it's not a serious film. So we really had chosen something that we thought we could relax in. And in the movie, there was a scene where Beethoven is in Vienna. He walks through a group of young musicians who all want to play for him. He's going deaf, but he hasn't told anybody, so he's trapped in his own agony. And as he walks through this group, one of the violinists standing there was a black violinist. And we looked at each other like, okay, we've heard of colorblind casting, but this is a bit extreme. And, Beethoven goes on and he goes into another room and lays his head against the piano so he can hear this vibration of the strings. Meanwhile, I was haunted by this notion that there was this black violinist. And so curiosity was what led me there. I wasn't thinking of writing a book at all. I simply went online and wrote in black violinist Beethoven, and there was one entry, and it was just a paragraph. Gave his name, George Bridgetower. That started me on a quest to find out more about him. And I just wanted to know more about him. I didn't want to write poems about him. I wanted to know more about him. Who was this person? And I was, in a certain way, ashamed that I did not know him. As someone who played music, that I didn't know more about him. The more what happened was that the way that I found out more about him was so curious, the little pieces that I got, that I realized that I was trying to find out more about him, assuming that I knew how he felt, and I did not know how he felt. I assumed, oh my gosh, to be an Afro-European, because I found out that his mother was white, his father was African, as the two lived that life, how much prejudice, how much discrimination he must have come up against. And I realized as I got deeper and deeper into the research that I was applying my American standards to him. I was imagining my world, and so I had to strip away all of that hubris and go into his world. I found out that Beethoven had indeed composed something for him. It's the Kreutzer Sonata. A lot of you may know the Kreutzer Sonata. It's not named after Bridgetower. And my first conclusion I leapt to was that, he didn't dedicate it to him because he was black. No, it wasn't that. It was because they got into an argument over a girl. And that Bridgetower had said something, as he said, saucy. He said something saucy about a girl. So that set me on another track. Well, what was the relationship between these two men? And it turned out that he and Beethoven were great friends for about 3 months, as they worked together. That Beethoven, who was going deaf, could love this man's playing, but also could watch him play, because he played with very extravagant. He played with movement, and so Beethoven could watch him and catch the beat. So there was a connection between the two. In looking for all of that, I began to discover a lot about what it meant to be dark-skinned in a Europe that had already stopped the slave trade, but still loved novelty, let's put it that way. And he spent most of his life in London. And so that idea of always standing out, or playing up to that standing out, became part of the story. Those were the things that I began to discover. I said earlier that you always needed to discover something new. I was discovering more and more things as I went into Bridgetower's life. At the same time, he was a brilliant player, and he led a charmed, one could say a charmed life as a musician and as moving in cultural circles, but he was always a novelty, too. There was always that. He knew how to use it, but it also imprisoned him. So.
Or Langston Hughes is banished prince, or is he the reinstated crown prince? Because, I mean, I find it quite curious that you create a language of entrapment around him, especially the way you physically describe him. And toward the end of the volume, when you just tell us, will I cry for you, Polgreen? Will I drag out your end, though it's long past? And finally, you ask the question, do I care enough, George Augustus Bridgetower, to miss you? I don't even know if I really like you.
Yes, well, because in the end, you see, one of the biggest problems with trying to trying to make a colorblind society or any kind of blind society, the blind is the perfect word for it, is our tendency to reduce everything to simplicities. Everything is complicated. That's a good thing. Everything is complicated. So, just because this mixed race violinist was a brilliant violinist and disappeared in history, and he was, half African, does not mean that he was necessarily a wonderful human being. It doesn't mean that he's automatically a hero because he was oppressed. I found that I kept pushing up against the fact that he was a chauvinist. But of course everybody was a chauvinist. So, so it was a man's world, and women didn't figure. The book is very, very male-oriented. There are maybe 3 women in the book. But that was the world he moved through. So my question at the end of the book was, I don't even know if I really like you. I felt that I had finally gotten close enough to him to be able to admit that, hey, I don't know. Would I have you as a friend? I don't know. And to me, that was a moment of freedom. That I was not making him into just some label, here he is. Look, he's a great musician. Look, he's a mixed race prodigy. But that he was a human being that I could then confront and say, could we have even talked?
Well, thank you so much for